Okay. This podcast series is part of the mission of the New York Intellectual Property Law Association, NYIPLA Past Presidents Committee, to preserve a snippet of the history of our association through the eyes of our past presidents, and to provide continuity for our century-old association's values and traditions for future NYIPLA leaders. I'm Rob Rando, current president of NYIPLA for the 2023-2024 term. We are very fortunate and pleased to have with us today Mark Abate. He was the 87th president of NYIPLA, and he served during the 2010 to 2011 term. Mark, welcome. And before we get into any questions, I turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Rob, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to you and perhaps future leaders of the association. But I thought I'd start with sort of three stories from my time with NYPLA, because I think they illustrate some interesting, ideas and lessons learned that maybe could be helpful to people in the future with the association. So the first is when I was a committee chair, and I chaired a few committees, but one year I was chair of the Inventor of the Year committee. And as part of that, when we had our recommendation, I was invited to a board meeting to speak about the recommendations. And the president at the time was Herb Schwartz, who was, one of the leading practitioners of the day at Fish and Neve. And I remember John Sweeney was on the ladder to be president also, because he was with my firm, Morgan and Finnegan. And he was another, leader in the day. And at that meeting, so I talked about my issue, but there was another committee, it was a young lawyers committee, wanted to have like a networking reception and needed, some amount of money to do that. And, they made their pitch to have the funding. And Herb Schwartz, who was president, said, we have to be known for more than just throwing a good party, referring to the judges' dinner. And, he was talking about the idea, obviously this was like a mixer, which is another type of party, but it was a networking type function. And he was talking about the idea of, encouraging young lawyers, in the association and in their careers. And that's something the NYPLA should be known for. So I heard that when I was, sort of a young lawyer and I was just a committee chair. So then years later, sort of fast forward, I'm on the board. And one thing we're considering is a diversity scholarship. This was probably like early 2000s, like around 2005 or 6. And at the time, the association didn't have a lot of money. We sort of ran year to year, and we made our money generally off the judges' dinner. And there was concern about, could we afford, and I forget the number we were talking about then, 5 or 10,000 a year scholarship. Could we afford that? And I told the board this story about my attending this meeting with Herb Schwartz and what he said. We have to be known for more than just a good party. And as a way of sort of advocating for the diversity scholarship. And the board went along with it, and not just because of what I said. I mean, a lot of people were in favor of it, but I think it's an interesting story. I think, the two things in juxtaposition, because I think what it shows is, one, how a prior generation of leadership sort of can speak to a later generation. And it shows that sort of Herb Schwartz's legacy as president was being channeled through me, at least 10 years later, when we faced this other challenge, which was, did we have the money to spend on a diversity scholarship? And the idea was, let's do this, and we'll figure out a way to fund it, because it's really a great thing to do for the association. So that was sort of one story I wanted to tell, which is sort of two stories combined, but I think there's a lesson there that's kind of nice. And then the second thing yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I think that's a perfect illustration of what we're trying to accomplish with these podcasts as well, to bridge through the generation. But go on.
Yeah, so I thought when I thought about this, I thought that would be a nice thing to start with. And then the second thing I was going to say was, about my own presidency. You mentioned I was 2009, 2010, which was the year immediately after the Great Recession. And that had its own challenges. A few years prior to my year, the dinner had 3,600 people. It was massive, and it was almost too much. And in my year, it had 2,400. So we went down significantly, right? Like 30%. And that presented financial challenges, because we had commitments to the group that was managing the association at that time and things like that. So my year was a bit of a struggle, financially, but there were a couple of things I wanted to accomplish my year. And one of them was the AIPLA was coming to town for its spring meeting. Now, typically when the AIPLA comes to town, the local IP association sponsors the event and actually donates, $5,000 or $10,000 to be a sponsor. So AIPLA called me and said, we'd like NYPLA to sponsor. And I said, oh God, we'd so love to sponsor. We're really aligned on the mission here, but it's a really tough year for us and we don't have the funding that you have. I really don't have the money to spend $10,000 to sponsor your event. Is there some other way we could work it out where maybe we could sponsor without a financial contribution? And the funny thing was the president of the AIPLA that year came to our judges dinner and came to our suite, and he was so impressed just the amount of people that we could bring to that dinner, the year prior to mine. And therefore, when I was negotiating with him, he was thinking, I really want that NYPLA mailing list. So he said to me, well, if you'd let us use your mailing list to publicize the event, we could give you a free sponsorship. And that was sort of a win-win because they could use our mailing list. We didn't have to pay, but also I wanted our members to know about AIPLA coming to town. So it wasn't something I was, I wanted our membership to be involved. So it was good that they used our membership list. And we got the benefit then of sponsoring out of that, which I think is a nice thing for the association because, again, it gives us, some publicity and some notoriety in the local market and the national market. And but the point there of that story, I think, is the idea that we have a tremendous brand that, the AIPLA would come to us and what everyone else is paying the AIPLA to achieve, they're essentially giving us for free because of all the regional associations, we are the strongest, the most robust, and many of those regional associations don't really exist anymore. So the point is we have a great brand, and I think it can be used appropriately to benefit our membership, and that was sort of one example of that. And then I would say a second thing I wanted to accomplish during my year was to have a great dinner like everyone wants to. And at that point, it just maybe a few years before my year, we started moving towards professional speakers, and some of them were very expensive. So I wanted to get a professional speaker because I think it kind of elevates the dinner to make it really an event. And I think it's difficult for the judges to carry that kind of audience. It's a little bit unruly. So I think it's unfair to the judges in some ways. So I wanted to have a speaker, but I didn't have a lot of money. So I hunted around and I found Mario Cuomo, the former New York governor, who actually as a speaker was not that expensive. So not only did I think he was a terrific speaker, but the price was right. We could afford that. So I was happy to be able to do that during my year, during the recession year also. And then I would tell one more story, which was a little bit different, which is I had a very difficult year with the board my year, and it had to do with a couple of things, but one was the financial situation. And I think there were a couple of people on the board that, were more of the, I don't want to be like too critical, but a little bit more like the bean counter mentality of like really worrying about the financials. And I think there's a place for that, but at the same time, you have to have a vision of where we want to get to. You don't succeed by constantly cutting. You have to actually add, and grow. So in the end, what happened was there was sort of dissension among the board, and it had to do partly with replacing the management group that we had and bringing in Feike and Robin. And that worked out fine over time. But I think the what I did essentially was as I left the presidency and became chair of the nominations committee for 2 or 3 years, I was really trying to be very thoughtful about the type of board members to place on the board to make sure that we had people that would keep track of things like finances and how we were doing as an association financially, but also have vision to try to bring us forward and move us forward. And I think what ended up happening is just a few years later, like by the time Tom Malora was president, which was just 3 years later, he told me like how incredible the board was and how everyone was working together and moving the association forward. And that wasn't the experience my year at all. It was very, very, difficult and hard to, there were a couple of real difficult folks on the board that made it hard to move the group forward. But nonetheless, I think we accomplished 2 really great things, which was to have a good dinner with a good speaker and to co-host this AIPLA meeting, along with all the other things we do, the amicus briefs and things like that. So that was sort of my introduction, Rob, and I'm happy to, address any questions you'd like specifically or talk more about what I spoke about.
No, I think your introduction is very valuable because it really speaks to what we are trying to accomplish, right? Which is to move the association forward, um, and have meaningful benefit for our members, and to contribute to the IP space, as we've done over the last 102 years. But let me get into some questions now, Mark. So tell us a little about you and where you are in your career today.
So I graduated law school in 1988, and then I clerked for Judge Markey, who was the chief judge of the Federal Circuit for 2 years, and that was in Washington, D.C. And then I came to New York after that, and I started at Morgan and Finnegan, which was a large IP boutique at the time. And I was there about 17 years, and I've been at Goodwin Procter currently in New York for about 17 years. So I have about 35 years in the profession, I would say, and most of my work over that time has been litigation. I would say pretty much all of my work, mostly district court, some ITC, some appeals, some PTAB work, things like that.
How has your practice evolved over the years?
I would say, I don't know if it's really evolved. I'm kind of doing similar types of cases and similar types of courts, but my career has evolved in that, I used to be sort of one of many, and now I'm sort of leading the matters. So I have a lot of different matters I'm leading. And most of the clients I represent are sort of on the East Coast. So not all in New York, but sort of between, say, Virginia and Massachusetts, and going out into the Midwest, some Midwestern clients. But I represent some great New York companies like IBM, and it's been a lot of fun representing them and others over time.
Sure.
And seeing how the law has sort of moved over the years, and today is a much more challenging environment for patent owners to assert IP rights, as I'm sure you're aware.
Yeah, no question about that. Okay, so how did you first become aware of NYIPLA?
Somehow, I don't know. I think I learned of it early on, like even when I was working for the judge. I think he attended the judge's dinner, but I believe I was even aware of it before that time when I was in law school. Oh, funny thing is, now that you mention it, Herb Schwartz actually came down and spoke to my law school he was doing a case for Polaroid versus Kodak.
Mhm.
And he came and spoke to our IP Law Association about that. That was one of the big cases of the day.
Yeah.
And the case must have just ended because he was speaking about what the experts talked about and things like that and how they presented the evidence. So I think I was aware of it through perhaps his coming down to our school, and also the judge's involvement with the judge's dinner.
And how did you first become involved with NYIPLA?
Well, the big IP boutiques like Morgan and Finnegan, when you joined, everybody joined NYPLA. It was like part of onboarding. The whole first year class. Okay, we're signing you up for NYPLA, and we're paying for it. So it was something that was really promoted by the firm. So I joined as soon as I came up here, and I've been a member ever since. And then eventually I got involved in a committee, and that led to other activities, and then board membership, and the latter to be president.
So basically, once you became part of Morgan Finnegan, it was just a natural to become a member of NYIPLA.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So,
Yeah.
what activities and roles that you engage in early on as a member?
I think I did some things with the Young Lawyers Committee just to meet some people because I was new to the city. And then I do remember chairing that one committee, Inventor of the Year. I probably chaired another committee also, before that. The Inventor of the Year was a nice committee to chair because you really have something to do. Like, there's something expected of you. Now, all the committees will do something, but you know how it is. If someone gets really busy, sometimes they put certain things aside. But with the Inventor of the Year committee, you couldn't do that because there was a certain point of the year you had to come to the board with a recommendation for the Inventor of the Year. So you had to, get out the announcements and review the nominations and things like that. So so that was a good committee to be involved with because you had something you had to do. And it also was good to be involved with because it gave some exposure to the board and sort of the larger, activities of the association.
Yeah, well, there was a date certain for the deliverable, right?
Right, exactly. Exactly.
So did there come a time when you decided you wanted to assume a leadership role, or did it just evolve over time?
It sort of evolved over time. And I think John Murnane, who was a president a few years before me, was the nominating chair at one point and asked me if I would be interested in doing it. And I was happy to, to get on the ladder. Actually, at first I guess first I was secretary for a couple of years. So he may have asked me to be secretary or perhaps on the ladder. I don't remember, but I was happy to do it because I would have been involved at that point. I'd been involved many years, so it was kind of natural.
So let's talk about your time as president. What was the trajectory in the organization leading to you becoming the president? I think you may have just said that, but is there anything more you want to add to that trajectory?
Well, it's funny, like, yeah, just a few years before me, we were having like tremendous success. The judges' dinner was getting bigger and bigger every year, and we were getting more notoriety, and our briefs were getting notoriety at the federal circuit. And then with the recession, that what ended up happening is firms started to look a little harder at expenses, and perhaps we're wondering why we had everybody signing up for these groups. Some people who don't really participate. So things changed a little bit, but we certainly had sort of a core group. I mean, we still had 2,400 people coming to the judges' dinner, which is a huge number. And we had a core group of committed people that would participate and be involved. And so it still was something, I think, a strong brand name that we could build on and a strong reputation that we could, continue to build on and grow.
Sure. So before we get into any specifics about your presidency, can you give us a general overview of the intellectual property landscape in terms of issues confronting the IP community during the time that you were president?
Well, I think there was in the 1980s, there was just tremendous emphasis on IP as a way of like moving the economy forward. I mean, you're probably aware, Rob, that
Sure.
the Japanese car companies were sort of hurting the US car companies, and Congress focused on what can we do to be more competitive. And one thing they thought about, among others, was strengthening the IP system. And that was then the origin of the Federal Circuit in 1982. And then later in the 80s, you had the Hatch-Waxman Act, which was a big boost for generic drugs. So the combination of those two things just made the field just explode, I think, and I would say, the field was growing and developing. That then drove more a greater diversity of law firms into the field. So you used to have these patent specialty firms, and then it was a greater diversity of specialty firms and general practice firms. And even general practice lawyers had never had patent cases, trying those cases or litigating them. But I think but going to your question a little more, I think more focused is, what was sort of different about IP. So when the Federal Circuit started, there was this emphasis on, okay, Congress wants to strengthen IP rights. Let's look at some of the law we have, and is that law really working? Where have IP rights unnecessarily or improperly been eroded? And there was, in the early years of the Federal Circuit, there was a real strengthening of the IP rights. And ever since, there's been sort of a slow stepping back from that, and you go back to in the 1990s, like the Markman decision, so we never had that. Now, we can argue whether that's good or bad, Markman, and I think probably it's good in a lot of ways, but it's sort of, I mean, today there are a number of hurdles that a patent owner has to get over to get his case to trial, his or her case to trial. And the first is going to be, today, Section 101 at the pleading stage. The second is going to be, you have your contentions now in all the local rules. We didn't have to do any of that. And the third, coming on the heels of that, is Markman. that you have to, have your construction relatively early in the case. And so Markman was new in the 1990s. The local rules probably came about 10 years later. But then after Markman, you had, eBay, which makes it much harder, almost impossible to get an injunction. And, you have the PTAB today, which is really, I mean, the thing about the PTAB is they say, well, they don't invalidate all that many patents. That's what they say. But in fact, the only ones they're considering are the ones in litigation, the ones that somebody believes has value. And they're knocking out like 50% of those. So 50% of, say, the patents that really matter are getting knocked out by the PTAB. So that's a difficulty. But if we sat around and kicked it around, Rob, there's probably 3 or 4 other hurdles that have been developed over the same time period, like Daubert motions on the damages experts, and the way we deal with summary judgments today. So there's lots of hurdles that the patent owner has to get over that we really didn't have, say, around 1990, when the focus really was on, in the years prior to that and through the early 90s on strengthening patent rights.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a couple of points that you brought to the fore here. I mean, certainly in the 80s, the effort was to strengthen the patent system. And I don't believe, that it's any coincidence that there was great prosperity during that decade following on that. And I think you can track that when the patent system is strongest, economically prosperity follows. And when you compare it to, the weakening, and what I see as the weakening of the U.S. patent system over the last, well, I mean, I see it from starting at eBay, right? So 2006.
Yeah.
It's quite a contrast, and it's very difficult to get that point across because there are so many conflicting interests at play in terms of how Congress ultimately will either act or continue to avoid acting. I'm sorry, we kind of get off on a tangent here, but I think you've raised very valid points, and I guess the only thing I would ask, and I need to correct myself, I think I said you were 2010, 2011, but it's actually you were 2009 to 2010, right?
Yeah, that sounds more accurate because it was right on the heels of the recession. Yeah, it was right. The recession was like 2008, 2009, and I came in right after that.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it was a tough time,
And
but we
I guess,
survived.
yeah, and I guess that during that time frame was the period of time when the negotiations of the American Invents Act were also
Right.
occurring, right? Because it came into play 2012, I think, or 13. It was enacted. Um, so, all right. Now, if you could give us a general overview of the tasks and responsibilities that you were charged with during your term as president. I think you've touched on several highlights. Are there any other tasks or obligations that you had to address during your presidency that you haven't already mentioned?
Yeah, well, one thing is I tried to get the committee sort of involved. So we would invite them to a board. We'd invite not all of the committee chairs, but like maybe half at a time to board meetings periodically, just so they could listen to what's going on and feel a greater connection with the association and the board. So that was something, I was happy to do, was sort of lead that. And the president immediately prior to me, Anthony Giaccio, did that as well. So I think I got that idea from him.
Do you have any specific goals or mission that you wanted to accomplish during the time of president uh, that you haven't already covered, and if you did, what are they?
I think I really already covered them, which was
Sure.
the AIPLA, getting a good speaker on a budget, and
Yeah.
also having a great dinner, and also putting the association in a good spot for the future. Because in my year and in Anthony's year, and even in Chris Hughes's year prior to Anthony, there was some dissension on the board. It started with Chris's year, and by the time it got to my year, it was kind of getting kind of difficult. So I felt at the end of my presidency and beyond, I sort of put the association in a good spot to move forward, with later presidents.
Well, you did a great job because so far I've had a very very good experience with my board. We're very cohesive. And I appreciate the fact that they're on board, no pun intended, with me for a lot of the initiatives that I'm trying to accomplish. So thank you. Um, so from your perspective, what was your greatest accomplishment or proudest moment during the time of the president? Again, you probably already told us.
It's funny. Probably my proudest moment on NYPLA was being on the board when we commissioned the diversity scholarship. That was really great. And in fact, it's really one of the proudest moments of my career. I've had a lot of, good moments and cases and things like that. But that was something I felt we really did that was really great. So I'm really very proud of that as a board member and just in general, in my career in general, I was really happy. But so there's an example of, what are the benefits of being involved with NYPLA or other groups like this? It's sort of an extracurricular, it takes time, but an opportunity to do something that is really great, great for the profession, great for law, great for the society in general, and to feel good about it in your career and take that away and you have that, forever. So that was something, it wasn't my year as president, but it was something I'm really happy that I was part of.
Well, that's wonderful. And it's all, I think it exemplifies what, I feel, and obviously you do as well, as a member of the profession, the obligation to pay it forward in one way or another. And that's a beautiful thing that you did.
Yeah.
Um,
I think it's, relatedly, I think, here in your year, you were the one that had this idea of a past president's committee. And I think it's a great idea along the lines of what we discussed on a prior phone call, which was, how can we help? We don't have to look at amicus briefs and things, but how can we help the current generation of leadership in terms of just giving some perspective on the past and also what we think the future could hold? And I think that's really a great role for the past presidents. We're sort of like, a sounding board available to you if you feel you need it and you'd like it. And it's, I think, based on the experience we all have being in, the role of president and in various board positions, it's really a role we could really, I think, help move the association forward.
yeah, it preserves the value of this association that's been around for 102 years.
Right.
And we'd like it to be around for another 102 years at least, right?
Yeah.
All right. So what advice can you give our younger or newer members of NYIPLA if they aspire to assume a leadership role or to one day maybe even become president of NYIPLA?
So I would say, get involved in the committees, in a committee, and there are some committees, like you were saying earlier, with sort of hard deadlines that, because of that, because of a deliverable being required, you may have a little more exposure to the board. And I think, you could try to focus on those committees from the standpoint of if you have more exposure to the board, you have a greater sense of what's going on in the association and the opportunities where you could contribute and participate. So I would say get involved in a committee. I also think that, there's no rush to get up the ladder. It's really, there's tremendous benefit in working at the low levels of the association. Like when you're a committee chair, you're meeting more people than when you're on the board, because in the committees, you have people come in and out every year. On the board, you're looking at the same 12 people every year. So, when you're in a committee, you have a tremendous opportunity to network with your peers here in New York and in the New York IP community. And it's just a wonderful opportunity. And then from there, as you see other opportunities to get involved and do work for the association, you can get involved in the things that interest you. And it'll just be natural that you'll meet more people and get more involved and be more integral, and then move up in the association. And if you want to become the president, it'll be available to you over time. And I think it's sort of it's an arc. There's no need to rush to get there early. It's there's a lot of things you can do throughout your career that can be meaningful and important, and you can really enjoy. So I would say take advantage of it at all stages.
Well, that's great advice, and you make a very good point about being involved and engaged in the committee or as the chair of the committee. I was involved in several of the committees and have been involved over the course of my career with as a member of NYIPLA, and it's invaluable. You're right in terms of the networking you're able to do and to really contribute. So I think you've covered it, but what advice would you give to younger, newer attorneys to get the most out of the benefit of the membership in NYIPLA?
Yeah, I would say what I said earlier is really get involved in the committees and meet some
Yeah,
folks. In any career, it's important to find mentors. And so you may have mentors at your firm. You may have like informal mentors through people you meet at NYPLA. And you may have other types of mentors, that you meet over time. And so I think it's very helpful and also meaningful to have mentors as you progress, and the association can provide some opportunities for that, and there'll be other opportunities as well, through employment and things like that.
yeah. And through our programming and our events, the opportunity to interact with federal judges outside of the courtroom is a tremendous benefit.
Yeah.
So, any final thoughts as we wrap
Yeah,
up?
it's just as you mentioned that, and I talk about mentorship, I had a final thought that I'll relay.
Sure.
So, I was in engineering school, and I went to engineering school, and I even got a job doing some engineering work. And my father was working at AT&T Bell Labs for many years. He was a PhD scientist, and he was involved in synchronization of changing the whole phone network to digital and synchronization of it. He was like the expert on synchronization.
Wow.
So in a way, it was sort of, at the time, it was the world's largest computer network, essentially. It had all these switches, and they were going from analog to digital. And that then allowed, I mean, it didn't, create the internet, but it allowed for the when the internet was later developed, the digital network allowed for that to facilitate that and make that happen. But
Yeah.
so my dad's working at Bell Labs in New Jersey, and I'm working as an engineer, and he says to me, Mark, I got to tell you, these the patent lawyers at Bell Labs, they have really interesting jobs, because he was working with a patent lawyer on something that one of his employees was working on, so he had some exposure to the patent law department. And he said, they have very interesting jobs. You might, maybe you want to consider a career in patent law.
Oh,
So
that's great.
yeah, so that, and then the funny thing was, I connected with some of the AT&T patent lawyers just to sort of interview them on what they were doing. And two of the folks I spoke to there, well, a long time ago, but they were really like legends, at the time. One was Seymour Hollander, who was the chief patent counsel at Bell Labs, and the other was Sam Duretsky, who was later in that role. And both of those guys gave me advice about, what it might be like to be a patent lawyer, and what they found interesting and challenging in their jobs, and what they enjoyed about it. And but based on this sort of tip from my dad, I sort of spoke to them, and then because I didn't want to jump into law school right away, I got a job at the patent office, and I sort of learned a little bit about patent law. They had a great program to teach engineers patent law, so you could examine applications. And after doing that, I then went to law school. But so I sort of wanted to give my dad a plug, to sort of get me started in this career. And I think he couldn't have foreseen, I couldn't have foreseen how great it would be, because with those developments in the 80s, drove the development of this field for 30 years. It's been crazy. So like my whole career has just been growth in patents and patent law. And the one thing about that, when I think about speaking to those lawyers from AT&T, when I was not a lawyer and not even in law school, I always sort of think about that. If I'm contacted, every now and then I get an email, just a random email from somebody at my undergraduate college who found me on LinkedIn and is thinking about going to law school. I'll talk to them, just tell them a little bit about patent law, because I felt like it was such a wonderful thing those guys did for me,
Yeah.
at my dad's request. So I try to do that, pass it forward, so to speak, or, pass it on. And so, help people and encourage them that it's really a great field. And it's still, even today, it's still a growing, dynamic field, and there's a lot of work, and it's very interesting, and you can have a great career. So that would be sort of my parting comments.
No, that's great. And I agree with everything you've said, and I too enjoy that mentoring for younger people who might have an interest in entering the field. And you're absolutely right. It is very exciting times to be engaged in the patent practice. You know, beyond just the patent law itself. Um, just take a look at the docket of the Supreme Court over the last 10 years. It's amazing, not only patent cases, but how many IP cases the Supreme Court has granted cert for. It's incredible as compared to other areas of law. We could probably go on forever about this, and
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
we'll fly off. But thank you so much. Really appreciate you taking the time out of what I know is a busy schedule to sit down and do this. I think it's a tremendous benefit to the association, and truly appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for taking the lead on this. It's really it's a great initiative, and I think it'd be valuable to future boards and future presidents.
Well, quite honestly, I'm enjoying it. I'm getting a benefit out of it because I'm learning a lot.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Take,
Okay, Rob, good talking to you.
all right, take care.